You're listening to Maneuvering Mondays, a podcast about transforming work culture.
And your hosts today are AK
and Ivana Rosendal.
Yes. And have you ever sat in a meeting that felt like it could have been an email, or maybe even nothing? Or maybe you've been in a meeting where your CEO announced the newest transformation program, but it sounded a lot like the one from last year, just with a new name. This is our first book swap episode, and we are so pleased to have you, Paul Sweeney, on the call with us. You're the author of the book Magnetic Nonsense, and you're here to discuss together with us what you call magnetic nonsense. And we'll be unpacking this topic of bullshit at work with you in the context of Marie's story in Maneuvering Monday. And maybe, Ivana, maybe you can tell us how you found out about magnetic nonsense.
Yeah, so I was on vacation at the North Sea, which is one of my favorite holiday spots to go in Denmark. And I was just like randomly looking around on Kindle, what is happening. And then I fell over your book, and I was like, then I read like the little intro section. I was like, oh my God, this sounds like something I must read. Then I downloaded it, and I was a little bit less present during that vacation than I would have liked, because I just kind of dove into your story and like, oh my God, was kind of the theme of how it felt to read it, because everything you write is so true, so horrible, and a little bit disheartening about the state of work, but absolutely true. And then I messaged you and asked if you would be willing to come on our show, and you actually said yes.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, it's great, and you know, obviously, then you sent me your book, which I loved, and I thought, what a fascinating book. Why, I really enjoyed it. I was telling you, I was kind of left hanging a bit when it was finished. I was like, oh no, don't finish here. I want to see what happened. But then that's life, right? It's like, yeah, you don't always have the Disney ending. Yeah,
exactly.
But I really loved it. It was a great read. I've read it again since.
Oh,
and I really liked it.
It's quite
Paul, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how you came to see that all the bullshit at work?
Yeah. So really quickly, I guess I had a strange career. I flunked out of university. My first job was in the lost baggage department of an airline, which was tremendous fun. And then I worked in many middle management roles before doing an MBA, working in a startup for a while, then accidentally as a management consultant for about 12 years. And then my sort of last corporate gig was chief strategy officer of a big real estate company here in the FTSE 100. So I've sort of worked right at the bottom of organizations all the way through the middle, and then seen many of them as a consultant, and laterally sort of worked at the top of an organization. But somewhere along that way, I was a bit like the kid from the Sixth Sense movie who started to see dead people everywhere. And I just kept seeing the same crap and nonsense, and, you know, the same weird language and the same idiotic things going on in every company of any size. And I guess I've been kind of thinking about it for a while. And then when I finished that job, the corporate job, I had a chance to take some time off, and I thought, you know, I'm actually going to sit down and try to figure out why all this nonsense happens. And is there a reason why no one ever seems to do anything about it? And that was kind of, then I spent a year laughing to myself in the corner writing this book, and I was pretty sure no one would ever read it. It turns out a few people have read it, and the feedback's been really interesting. There's a theme. There was a guy called Carl Christian from Norway. He really made me laugh. He contacted me and said, I've had to stop reading your book. It's too painful.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say it's...
Yeah. He said, because, you know, all the things that I've been promoting for the last 20 years, like, I've suddenly realized it's all wrong. And it's really uncomfortable. Yeah. So there's
exactly.
This kind of...
That's how I felt in some parts too.
Yeah, so I think the audience kind of self-selects, because it's either people who are willing to be thoughtful and challenge their views, or they're looking at it going, I don't know what you're talking about. You're crazy. Yeah, it's been kind of fun.
I don't want to know. Yeah.
Yeah. It's easier not to think about it, right? Yeah, in some ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that also when Ivana told me about this book and I've read your book, I felt like it was such a great connection to Maneuvering Monday, because I think that you kind of diagnose all these absurdities of modern organization, whereas we have tried to write a story about someone living these absurdities and trying to navigate all these dysfunctions. And I feel like it's both books kind of have this really uncomfortable truth, as you say, that organizations are just full of smart people doing really dumb things.
Yeah, I know. And that actually, the thing I loved about your book as well is it really, in my book, I talk a bit about one of the things we could learn from is complexity theory. And, we constantly oversimplify the world to give us comfort. But I think one of the great things about your book is it just shows how much more complex everything is than people think. And and much more human as well, right? So it's messy. That's what I love about your book. It's it's gloriously messy. Everyone has their preconceptions, but also, a lot of it is wrong. Everyone has their personal lives, things that they didn't know about each other. It's just really nice and messy. I like it.
Exactly. Yeah. We try to show exactly that. And hopefully people could recognize that feeling of like, I try so hard to do the best thing and it's still it was maybe the right thing, but it still failed because of the complexity of human
was it the right
behavior.
Was it the right thing? Is the question. Yeah. What is the right thing?
Yeah, true.
It's really an interesting, it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah. And the system changes, like once you impact it in one way or another, then the system is different. And then even though it might have been the right maneuver, it may end up not being the right maneuver.
Yeah, it's always fun trying to figure out what the unintended consequences are, right? You change an incentive to try to get people to behave in a certain way, and then you get this completely crazy outcome. It's I've seen this in a bank where they wanted is a commercial bank, so dealing with businesses, and they wanted the relationship managers to be more customer focused. So they changed their bonus. So a big chunk of their bonus was based on the customer net promoter score. But instead of actually making them more customer focused, they then spent all their time canvassing the customer for the score. and they would even ring up the customers and say, well, I know you didn't get that loan, but it wasn't my fault. So can you please give me my NPS score? And they actually spent, most of their time after that just trying to get the score, which is, wasn't really what they wanted from the change. But it always amuses me that, when people don't realize that humans are good at gaming stuff, right?
Yeah.
And if you force them into a place where you incentivize them like children, then they're going to behave like children.
Yeah, and it becomes more about the game than actually the value that they were supposed to create. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Always funny.
Yeah. I had a similar experience with a delivery driver who had a very hard time finding my address. So I went down to the street and was trying to find him eventually. And then 15 minutes later, I found out where he was. And the first thing he said to me, please give me 5 stars. I did my best.
Yeah. It's crazy. It's completely crazy. Yeah.
So I think maybe for listeners who are more here to hear Paul and didn't read Maneuvering Monday, I will just give a little a little recap of that story, and then maybe Paul afterwards we could hear a recap of your book, just to set the stage before we dive into the book swap session where we will talk about how we can apply the learnings from Magnetic Nonsense to Marie's journey.
Yeah.
And in Maneuvering Monday, I will try to do this without spoiling the whole thing. But as we just briefly touched upon, it's a story about the head of development HR, Marie, who is working in this company. Everything is completely fictional, called Zebra Apps. It's an edtech company. And in the beginning of the book, we established that there's a problem with people leaving Zebra Apps. And Marie has a background in management consulting. She's working in HR, and she's tasked with finding out why people leave and eventually fixing this problem and trying to get the company back on track. And she then launches a culture program, thinking that this is the right thing to do. But in this journey of trying to do this, she learns so many things about why the company is really dysfunctional, and that actually the problem is a lot more serious or a lot more important than only keeping the talent. So there's all these learning, as we talked about, with how people have their own agendas and how, there's a lot of good intentions, but there's just so much trouble in all departments, basically, and especially one department that Marie eventually joins and tries to fix the problem from within. And I think that's overall story. Ivana, do you have anything to add?
It's a great story. I loved it.
Thanks.
I think that's a great recap. And then stuff happens.
Yeah.
That's so much stuff. Yeah.
Well, Paul, would you tell us brief overview of Magnetic Nonsense for people who might not have read it?
Yeah, so I gave a talk about this the other day, so it's in my mind. So I guess in the world, we have a very consistent narrative about what we think we need to make organizations great. And it's, nobody really argues about it. And it goes like this. You just need the right leader with the right stuff, with the right values to create this culture, that makes everyone behave in an amazing way. And then we can throw in some sprinkling of well-being and performance management and diversity. And, and that's kind of the answer, right? So if we just get those things right, then, then everyone should be like, it should be just amazing. And, to back that up, we have 150 years of studying leadership now, about 75 years of studying culture since the term culture was invented by a Canadian management consultant. And, and we have endless MBAs and leadership development programs. And in the UK, we have over 50,000 executive coaches on LinkedIn and 92,000 people claiming that they're culture change experts. Okay, so but there's only one problem with all of this stuff, is that none of it works. So if you look at, you have endless corporate scandals, every year, companies behaving really badly, damaging the environment, making unethical decisions. You have, according to Gallup, whose methods I don't really like, but even if they are directionally correct, in the UK, only 1 in 10 employees is actually engaged at work. You have other research coming out from Mental Health Foundation saying 96% of people had at least one burnout in the last 12 months. So you have all this, all this dysfunction, all this bad behavior, all this unhappiness, but yet no one ever steps back and says, but okay, wow, if all that stuff we keep on talking about isn't actually doing anything, shouldn't we try something else? So that was kind of the start of the book, was thinking, well, why is it we believe all this stuff? And that led me down a number of roads. One, it turns out that we have some cognitive biases that are a hangover from evolution, really. And there are 3 that are really interesting. One is a massive aversion to uncertainty. If you were a really honest CEO, you'd probably say, actually, you know what? I've got no idea what it's going to take to make this company better. Why don't we go and play with some stuff? But nobody wants to hear that, because we like the illusion of certainty that CEOs give us, even though they're just ordinary people and they know no more than we do. And there was interesting research in London, University College London's neuroscience department. They asked people to play this game, a video game where you had to look underneath rocks, and if there was a snake underneath the rock, you got an electric shock, which was uncomfortable, not lethal, but uncomfortable. And as the game progressed, people got better at predicting which rocks had snakes under them. And all the time they were being monitored, with cortisol, sweat levels, pupil dilation, stuff like that, very sophisticated modeling. And then the game changed so that it became less easy to predict whether the snake was under the rock. And the really interesting thing in the experiment, it turned out that it was way more stressful not knowing whether you were going to get an electric shock than knowing that you were. Isn't that
wow.
interesting?
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's like, I guess if you go to the train station and you get one of those, your train is delayed and it's really hard to figure out when it's going to go. That's more stressful than knowing your train has been cancelled, even though the outcome might be worse, right? Then we have this other deep human need for sense making, which some scientists are now saying it should be recognized as as strong a human drive as the drive for food or sex. We every early human civilization has got a creation myth, for example, that explained to the people, how did we get here? What was it all about? What were the sun and the moon and the stars doing? We have this deep need for sense making. But those 2 things, the aversion to uncertainty and the deep need for sense making, they leave us open to incredibly simple explanations of the past. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, he put it much better than me. He said the illusion that we've understood the past feeds the further illusion that we could predict and control the future. And so that, that's really quite interesting. And then the third bias is this thing called belief perseverance, where once we form these ideas, for example, about leadership and culture and values, even in the face of really overwhelming evidence that they don't work, we're still incredibly reluctant to let them go. It almost requires a crazy avalanche of evidence, where it's too much, but we don't like to let these things go. So there's all that going on. And then the book gets into all the things, all the kind of scaffolding that holds this stuff in place. So this Disneyfication of leadership that I call it, the hero leadership cult. Great servant leader will save us. They just need to start with why. Simon Sinek's crap. And so we got this you got this weird Disney nonsense going on. We've got this concept of culture that really makes me laugh because, as I say, it was only invented in the 1950s. No one had ever heard of it before that. And there's not really much evidence that culture exists, but yet everyone talks about it as if it's a thing. And what I think it does is it makes us incredibly intellectually lazy, because every time a company does something bad, the answer is, oh, it was the culture. So we've created this kind of abstraction layer that allows us to point the finger at this thing and then say, the answer to the problem is to change the culture. But if culture isn't even a real thing, then we're just pointing the finger at something kind of imaginary, right? And in my book, I draw the parallel between culture and witchcraft in the 15th century in the UK. Everyone believed witches were real, to the extent that the British or the English Parliament at the time passed 2 laws making the practice of witchcraft punishable by death. And then they executed 300 women in the following several years on the pretext of being witches. So yeah, it's interesting. And so this whole kind of the leadership thing, the culture thing, all this nonsense about values, which I know featured in the book, but there are all these things that don't make any difference, but we spend vast amounts of time thinking that they do. And then it's all held up by leadership development, MBA teaching. There's a kind of a cycle. It all just goes round and round and round. And then we reward people that conform to it all. We don't look for the mavericks or the people with a different perspective. Yeah. So the book, there's a lot in the book, but it sort of goes through a lot of stuff around why it's all nonsense, and then, makes some suggestions for some stuff we could do different. I mean, I certainly wasn't going to fall into the trap of the consulting nonsense in the book of all you need to do is this is 10 steps to success, or
follow this model, then you will succeed.
A 2x2 matrix. Yeah. But the book does finish with, it took me a while to figure out how to finish it, but it finishes with an open letter to the CEO, which is saying, look, the bad news is your organization is really dysfunctional. The good news is you're not special.
Yeah.
And therefore, here's a whole bunch of things that you might want to think about testing and trying differently. I don't know, they're not the answer necessarily, but it's a good start. Yeah. So that's kind of how the book flows.
Yeah. And I love the conclusion also, because in life, I think that is also the conclusion that I have arrived at. That's, there is no guides, there are no 10 steps, but we can try things, and things can be incrementally better than they were before, even though we might not solve for everything.
No. And if you could solve everything, life would be really boring, right? What would you do? What would you do then? But one of the really interesting things for me is that, we have a system of organizing. Oh, I should have mentioned also, the book talks a lot about power as the real culprit to some of this dysfunction, instead of culture, which is a kind of a largely made up and silly idea. But one of the really fascinating things is that our organizational thinking, the evolution of our thinking, seems to have stopped around the 1950s or 60s. And so few organizations actually try experimenting with a different way of organizing themselves, which I think is really hilarious, because they all talk about innovation and creativity and being agile, but then they all run as if they were still in the 90s with these hierarchical models of command, control, parent-child, systems. Yeah, so I find this really interesting that very, very few people ever even think about trying anything different.
Yeah, that is, it's almost, you compare it to witchcraft. For me, it also makes me think of during the plague, where we had the White Brothers who were just whipping themselves, trying to obsolete themselves from sin, because they wanted to do something and make sense of what was happening around them and have some agency.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's just, the whole thing is endlessly curious to me.
I want to dive more into this management consultants part, because you were an accidental management consultant. I was also an accidental management consultant for
Me too.
5 years. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So consulting is a really interesting thing. And in the book, I kind of, I had to go at working out why it works. It's based on those cognitive biases, right? So I came up with a kind of a nonsense framework, which I think consultants use. Maybe not completely knowingly, but it's very fun. And it goes like this. It's just like step one is trigger our aversion to uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be, for example, if you're not deploying AI all over your company, it's too late. You're going to get left behind. Everyone's already gone. All your competitors are ahead of you. So we create this kind of a big trigger for uncertainty. Step two is give the illusion of sense making, which is, we understand all this stuff. Yeah, we're expert consultants. We know everything about AI, which really is quite funny because even the people who built the models don't know how they work. But that's just an inconvenience. Yes. And then step three is promise control over the future. So hire us. Yeah. We'll shape your AI strategy and we'll make sure that you are amazing and you'll outperform all your competitors. So there's this kind of this is the messaging. Yeah. And it was the same with, I talked in the book, it was very funny, the metaverse, which no one's talking about now. 3 years ago, all the consultants, Accenture was saying it'll be worth $30 billion a year, the metaverse economy. And, 50% of all transactions will be impacted by it. And, they created all this panic, It's like, oh no, what is it? What is this thing? Help. I don't want to get left. I don't want to get left behind. And then they persuaded their clients to invest in all kinds of nonsense, like buying virtual land in the metaverse. And then when it all fell apart and is now all worthless, I'm pretty sure all the consultants just did a search and replace for metaverse and replace it with AI in their job descriptions and thinking, and just pretended that it never happened. So It's curious. Now, having said that, there are a whole bunch of smart people working in consulting. And when you do get good consultants, they will come along and rely on the same framework, that they used 20 other times. They'll actually, if you get good ones, they'll actually be thoughtful and help you challenge your thinking and test new things. But the consulting machine doesn't produce many of those. No, it produces a lot of clones rolling out the same old stuff. So it's a curious thing. And then what the consulting firms are very good at, McKinsey's model actually is not really consulting. It's alumni management. Yes, so McKinsey has this brand. I think if you're a McKinsey consultant, you have better odds than any employee of any other company of becoming a CEO in a big company later. For some reason, even though most of their stuff they have this brand. Their consultants are sought after in industry. They get into senior positions and then they call up their buddies and bring them in again. Yeah. And it just goes round and round. Same with MBAs. But yeah, consulting, it's a curious thing. And people are saying now the model is dying, a bunch of stuff will be replaced by AI. I don't think it's dying. I think there will always be people that fall for the 3-step framework. Yeah. It'll always be a safe option for executives who can tell their boards that they're bringing in a McKinsey or an Accenture to do something. I don't like it. I think it's bad for society. I think it's bad for the world as a model. I mean, I hope it dies, but I'm not convinced it will.
I don't think it'll die, also because it is ingrained in the system, as you were mentioning. One of the tropes of the business fable genre is that there is this very wise external party that comes into a company that has all the answers, that has the model, kind of like the consultants. And one of the things we didn't want to do for Maneuvering Monday is have that all-knowing person.
Yeah.
We do kind of tease the audience with introducing Anne.
Yeah.
Who is now a consultant, but who used to work for Zebra Apps, who gives Marie a bunch of advice. And I will not spoil whether that advice is actually useful or not.
It's a really interesting dynamic, and I love in the book that you that Marie does a double take almost when she sees Anne dressed in this power suit and now looking like a consultant instead of being in a t-shirt when she was a tech person.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that was a nice.
But I think we do have a theme there around like Marie coming from a background in management, more classic management consulting, where she tries to apply this toolbox that she learned, whereas Anne came from, a role in the work in Zebra apps, and she now uses her experience with that to advise Marie.
Yeah.
So what do you think of this?
Oh, yeah.
You can say dynamic of observing from the outside or actually joining like the engineering department to try to change things from the inside?
So I would probably say the best consultants I've worked with were the ones who had quite a lot of industry experience and then went into consulting. The worst ones I worked with were the ones who went straight in from university into consulting and never really had a proper job. And, when I was a consultant, I found it really useful having had that experience, working in airlines, working with crazy people, working in heavily unionized environments. You just learn a lot about how people think, behave. And that experience really helps you later. But I think I would have struggled if I'd just gone into consulting straight out of university, because where's your kind of reference points? Where's your experience? So that I think it just doesn't work,
I've seen a lot of consultants who did come straight from university who failed to understand like the complexity of an organization and assume that, we have found the best way. Now you just need to do it. The doing it is the hard part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, anyone can work out the spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Getting people to do something different is always the interesting bit. So I definitely have some sympathy for that view that actually you need to get into the work, because otherwise it's just theoretical. If you're just moving boxes around in an org chart, you're just kidding yourself, really.
Yeah.
And it's funny how, if you look at the very big companies, I don't know what it's like in Denmark, but if I look at the big banks, the big insurance companies, the big utility companies, I mean, they've had 20 years of giant investment in consulting firm transformation projects, and yet they still can't answer the phone and give you a simple answer to your query. If anything, they've gone backwards. But no one ever kind of says, well, hang on. Yeah, we spent £10 billion over the last 10 years with McKinsey or Accenture or whatever, but our Trustpilot score is still 1. So, which was the case in Lloyds Bank. Their Trustpilot score is 1.6, being the lowest. Wow. And they keep droning on about how they're creating exceptional customer experiences through transformation, but no one's told their customers.
No,
they still think they still think it's hopeless. It's really quite funny. Yeah.
Paul, what about like having looked around and realized that corporations are naked?
Yeah.
Like, what does one do? Advising is one thing, leading is another, but then you end up with having to deal with all the bullshit that's already there. What is one to do?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think my feeling is that it's helpful to be a bit more evidence-led, right? So if you could fundamentally, companies, I think, are in this mess because of a huge lack of critical thinking. It's just this sort of mindless conformity to all these so-called best practice. And I described my definition of magnetic nonsense is a strange dimension we're in where best practice reliably leads to worst outcomes, but no one ever questions it. So there is just something about if you could get leadership teams to step back for a minute and go, okay, this is what we believe. Where's the evidence? And what does it say? Brilliant things like every company invests heavily in well-being, which I'm actually pretty sure is part of the problem, that we spend all our time kind of subliminally telling people they should be unwell because we keep on talking about well-being and mental first aiders and stress and resilience, But Oxford University did a very large study in 2023 looking at about 40,000 employees in the UK that all had access to your typical well-being interventions, stress and resilience training, mindfulness, mental first aiders, all this other stuff. And their conclusion was that none of it made any difference to anybody. Apart from if you put your people through stress and resilience training, you make them more stressed and less resilient. That was the finding.
Oh, God.
So you just have, so you have this giant industry of stuff that's going on, and it makes no difference.
Yeah.
Performance management is the same, incredibly biased and useless. employee engagement surveys are a waste of time. There's all this noise and stuff going on that just saps the energy out of companies and costs a lot of money. I know you in the book you I guess Marie kind of used the values as a bit of a way to start having the conversation, didn't she?
Well, she is
But again,
from a consulting company.
Yeah. But I think values are particularly hilarious as it goes, because not only is there no evidence that values change people's behavior, there's a ton of evidence that they made absolutely no difference when people did behave badly. And it's almost comical, in fact. If you look at Wells Fargo, I think their values were what's right for the customer, ethics, and leadership. And they were fined $3 billion for spuriously opening fake customer accounts to hit their targets. So they did what was wrong for the customer, was unethical, and was appalling leadership.
Yes.
Boeing's values were safety, quality, and integrity. And they've been fined $2.5 billion deliberately covering up safety and quality issues that are implicated in the deaths of nearly 400 people with plane crashes. It's kind of, it's almost beyond belief that we think somehow that values make a difference. And I've come to the conclusion that when you have power and when you have perverse incentives, there are no values that will stand up to those things. Those things will win. So, in my view, you're much better off trying to figure out what to do about that than launching another values program.
Yeah.
And I think this is actually where we have been in our own process when we wrote this book, because when we started out, our initial idea was actually to write a book about cultural transformation and how you can kind of work with culture in a more tangible way, how you can try to take this really intangible concept and actually do something and try to focus more on the behavioral part. And then we started writing the book and we got all these great expert guests in our podcast to give us feedback.
Yeah.
And we also slowly kind of found out that it wasn't really working with this culture program, and Marie had to do something different, and we had to pivot and we had to come into this whole other part about the book about the structure and the system and how we're organized. And as you say, about all the power dynamics and
and it's really interesting in the book, I think, when one of the most interesting things I thought in the book was when the engineers, they kind of sabotaged the company in a way, right? Because they were told to code and not meet and all that stuff, but they could have easily resisted that and worked around it. Yeah. But it's almost like they went, well, if you want to do that, then we're going to let you run this company into the ground. Yeah. And it's kind of a curious dynamic there. I think that a lot of the time, the people at the bottom of the hierarchy don't seem to understand that they have more collective power than they think. And, they could have overturned that situation if they'd really wanted to, right? If they work together, but yet they almost behave like children, right? It's like, you told us we can't do this, so now we're going to make sure nothing works. It's kind of yeah. So that was a really interesting power dynamic in the book, I thought.
Yeah, but this is one of the things when we were writing the book and we had these guest experts come in on the show and comment, several of them said, like, this is completely unacceptable. That's, like, at least in the end, there's this coalition of employees who do try, employees and people outside of the company, who try to kind of remedy the destiny of zebra apps. Yeah. And a lot of our guest experts were like, this is unacceptable. The leadership and the board are the leaders, and they should follow like the strict distribution of power as per paper.
Yeah. But, that's clearly why things were going wrong, right?
Yes.
And what makes us, it's what it always kind of strikes me curious is that you have an organization with hundreds or even thousands of smart people in it. Why do we think that one or two people or three people are qualified to make all the decisions? And, about the future of the company. It's really bizarre. Yeah, it's a really funny thing, but we love it. We love this idea of heroic leaders, mainly white middle-aged men in reality, who are charismatic, tall, mostly, and are just going to save everybody because they're so amazing. And despite the fact that it never works, we just go and hire the next one, right? Actually, I had ended up in a conversation with the new CEO of Unilever the other week because he was interviewed by Barclays in London at an event. And the Barclays guy put this post on LinkedIn saying, oh, this is great. Look how decisive, this guy is. He's like waging war on mediocrity. He's going to drive accountability, all the usual shit. And in my book, I basically said, for some reason, no matter how much you pay these guys, they can only ever come up with one of these 10 ideas. And I said, oh, look, here's Fernando. He's chosen, 4, 7, 8, and 9. It's like, why are they never able to come up with an idea of their own? And I kind of said, I tagged him and said, you said you're waging war on mediocrity, but your plan is the definition of mediocre, my friend. And then he I saw he looked at my profile, so I sent him a note saying, you're probably wondering who this asshole is that called you mediocre, but here's what you should, here's what you should think about. And he did say he was going to buy the book and have a read, but we'll see.
Good start.
We'll see if he does. Yeah.
But Paul, I do want to ask you, because I hear that you are very much against the concept of defining corporate cultural values and trying to roll them out. But then in your perspective, how do you set an expectation for the behavior you would like to see in the company? Is it just about the leaders having this behavior, or is there anything else you can do?
So firstly, I would say it's sort of an odd thing, right? Because I guess my general feeling is that most people at work are adults who are perfectly sensible, who have a very good sense of what's right and wrong, which they manage their own lives perfectly well with. So why do we have to tell them how to behave? Mm-hmm. It's just kind of weird, right? Yeah. I mean, nobody has to tell me how to behave at work, or I just kind of there are norms. I have a pretty good sense of what's right and wrong, what's ethical and what's not ethical. So firstly, I think the whole concept is curious. I did find there's a Dutch mortgage broker called Vizzy, which is an interesting company. And the guy there said, the CEO there said, yeah, I couldn't be bothered with all this values and culture nonsense. I went back and looked at religion and philosophy, and it seems that almost every religion has a very similar kind of rule, which is basically translated as treat other people like you want to be treated yourself. So he said that's our kind of one, statement we have. We encourage people to think about that from the point of view of the customer as well as their colleagues, and and everybody seems to kind of get it, and I think that's nice. It's simple, but they trust people to get on with it. It's I find the question weirdly parent-child. How do we get people to behave? It's kind of.
I think of it more in the way, as we talked about before, a really great idea to have in the work is critical thinking. But maybe that's hard for some people. So how do you kind of facilitate that people have critical thinking in their daily work? How do you tell them that that's what you expect without being a parent to a child?
Yeah, it is tricky because the hierarchy often makes it reasonably unsafe to be a critical thinker. Yeah. Particularly if you're going to be critical of the ideas of your superiors, which are often really dumb. So there are some ways. I think you could train people to think critically, and Ireland has done that in interesting. So they have these kind of citizens forums where the government seeks help on trying to formulate policy on difficult decisions. So they gather kind of 100 people or so that are broadly representative of the population, and then the first thing they do is give them critical thinking training before they look at the problem. Yeah. So now it isn't just everyone's opinions against everyone else's opinions. They're actually thinking properly about it. So, well, I think it's an essential part of leadership development. Most leadership development is a complete waste of time. This probably would be useful. You can also do things like one of the things I mentioned in the book. If you are designing a change program or a transformation program, or something like Marie was trying to do, you can use this thing called a pre-mortem, which I think is good fun, which gives people permission. Because what you can do there, you get your team in a room and you say, right, it's 2 years' time, and our culture change program has been a complete car crash. It's totally failed. Everyone thinks it's the biggest heap of crap we've ever seen. It's been a disaster. Now let's try to figure out what happened. And changing that kind of narrative gives people permission to voice the concerns they didn't want to talk about before. So that's a pretty good aid, I think, to critical thinking, is once you get those juices flowing. It's the other thing I've seen work is there's a system called holacracy. I don't know if you guys have come across that. It's
yes.
I find it a bit intense, but one of the things I loved about it was their meetings are facilitated. And in the meeting, they make everybody sort of be quiet while other people are talking. You can voice the fact that you have an issue. I think they call it a tension. And then, that you might have a proposal. But then the facilitator goes through a series of questions, which are like, well, do you have any data to back that up, or is it just your opinion?
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting process that takes away some of the hierarchy and noise and status, and asks some very difficult questions. And then there are some very, if somebody objects to something, one of the questions then is, well, okay, if that's just based on your opinion, we either overrule it, or is there a way we can test this proposal on a small scale to see if you're right or wrong? So there's just it's a more intelligent way of running meetings, I think. So there's something about that too. So if you combined critical thinking with a very different way to run some of these meetings, I think you might be able to make some progress, I think.
I think like this, I do want to dive a little bit deeper into this culture aspect, or at least like how do we define how we behave together? Because, for example, AK and I, we have actually like sat down and defined, well, how are we going to behave together in this project that is Maneuvering Monday?
Yeah.
For example, like a key parameter is it's always okay to like that kids interrupt and are involved, because we are both we both have families, and that has to be okay. And what else we've got? That we distribute the work according to who finds it the most fun.
Yeah.
And there are other rules that
by the way, I think that's a great rule for most work, because it's who's got the most energy to do this? Yes. It would be a great question. So the whole thing about culture gets confused, right? Yeah. We can't see culture, we can't touch it, we can't even define it. There's the CIPD, which is the UK's governing body for HR people, which is one of the most useless organizations in the world. But they occasionally do something accidentally good. And one thing they did was they commissioned the Centre for Evidence-Based Management to do a big study on all the academic research about culture and whether there's a link between culture and performance. And the paper is really, really fascinating. And it comes up with 3 conclusions. It says the first conclusion is there's no consensus on what the corporate culture even means, or whether it exists. The second conclusion was that even if there was a link between something called culture and organizational performance, it's too weak to be statistically significant. And the third conclusion of the report was that no evidence is found to suggest that trying to change the culture ever improved anyone's performance. So those are pretty fun findings. So I guess what I would say is I'm not sure we need this idea of culture. The thing we can see is behavior. So we can see how people behave. Exactly. We can see that people behave differently in different contexts. What's really interesting is there are super predictable behaviors that derive from power and status. And this is where it gets interesting. If, in the UK, if a big company implodes in a scandal, they'll eventually convene a public inquiry of some kind, normally overseen by some crusty old lord or lady, something or other, who's about 1 million years old. And it costs millions, but I could save them all the money because the output is always identical. It was the culture. That's the output. Always. It's the same thing every time. It's hilarious. But the behaviors you see are the ones that are entirely predicted by power. So there's a guy called Paul Piff runs a morality lab in University of California, Irvine. And his research is really interesting. And so it predicts that if you give people too much power, they'll become detached from reality over time. They'll lose their empathy for the common people. They'll start to make decisions that favor themselves. They'll think they're smarter than everybody else. And they're more likely to condone unethical behavior over time. Aren't these all the behaviors that we blame on culture every time?
Yes.
Yeah. And isn't that kind of interesting, right? That we blame this abstract thing called culture, but there's plenty of evidence to show that it's the hierarchy of power that causes it. It's not the culture. And if it was culture, we wouldn't see the same behavior every time because it should be different, right? In theory.
Yeah.
So this is sort of interesting. So I would say, let's stop talking about culture. Let's talk about behavior. Let's talk about power. Let's try to figure out, with some experimentation, if we change the power dynamics, do we get a different set of behaviors? Would be fascinating. And there's a reasonable amount of evidence from companies that have moved to much more flat models of hierarchy, much more self-organizing teams, there's a reasonable bunch of evidence there that works really well, and makes people happier, costs less, and has better outcomes.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, it has gone crazy now, this cult of leadership thing. I think in the Fortune 100 in the US now, time ago, the average, the median pay of the CEO, when you include all the stock options and stuff, is now about 450 times the average employee.
Wow.
It's completely crazy. Yeah, and what do you get for it? 1 of 10 ideas that are on this list in
Nonsense.
the book. Nothing else.
Magnetic nonsense. Yeah.
Nothing. Yeah, nothing else. Yeah. So I've come to the conclusion that culture is an unhelpful thing because it gives us something that's lazily blamable for things that go wrong, and it diverts us from looking at what are more likely suspects, I think.
Yeah. I think that's a great conclusion. Let's talk about power then.
Yeah, power is fascinating. So this guy I mentioned, Paul Piff in California, he's done some really interesting experiments. My favorite was he sent his researchers out to a pedestrian crossing in California and told them to try to cross the road. And in doing so, they were to categorize the cars coming down the road. Category 0, I think, being the cheapest, oldest cars, up to category 5, which are the really expensive, typical executive sort of cars, your, high-end stuff. And then they set about trying to cross the road, and 0% of the cheapest cars failed to stop and yield. 45% of the most expensive cars just drove right through them as if they weren't there. And I thought, wow, this is really, really fascinating. The other thing we didn't touch on was also all of the management literature, the success books, the MBA teaching, everything else. It completely ignores things like serendipity and random chance and good luck. It's completely as if those things don't exist, but arguably they are hugely important in business success. And one of these other experiments was he would get pairs of strangers off the street to play a game of Monopoly, but the game was rigged, clearly rigged, that they could see that. One person had twice as much money at the start. They got to roll the dice twice instead of once in every go. And clearly, they had a huge advantage. And very quickly in the game, you could see on the video that power dynamics were starting to emerge. The people with the more money, they were now doing this, sitting back, banging the table loudly. They ate more of the snacks than the other person in every case. And of course, they won the game, right? But what was really interesting at the end of the game, when they were interviewed and asked how come they'd been more successful in the game, none of them mentioned the fact that the game had been rigged in their favor. They all said it was because they were a better player.
Of course.
So it was, so there's all these really interesting things going on when you put people in positions of power, and then you add to that then that you're less and less likely to be challenged because of the safety reasons of the that, and you can see why. Oh, and the other thing is, once you get to a certain level of power and wealth, you don't hang out with normal people anymore. You hang out with people like you. You go to the events that are put on by McKinsey or the business school.
Yeah.
You read the same books. You live in a bit of an echo chamber now. Yeah. Whereas I quite think the German model is very interesting. If you have over 2,000 employees, you must give 50% of the seats on the main board to employees.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really interesting idea because it forces you back into reality almost.
Yeah.
Because you now have people on the board that are impacted by your dumb ideas instead of just people nodding along, So I think, this whole thing of power is a very fascinating area, really.
What about the cousin empowerment? Because that is another popular concept.
Yeah, it is. And it turns out that that's not so easy, right? Because there's a few things going on. One is we have effectively conditioned people to seek direction and management. And there is some comfort in that, because if you're at the bottom of the hierarchy and things go wrong, you can just go, oh, it was their fault. Those guys, look at those dumbasses doing it again. So there's some psychological comfort in not taking responsibility for anything. And it also turns out if you genuinely want to empower people, you kind of have to make sure they're able to deal with conflict, and they have some emotional awareness on how to deal with other people. Because once you put them in a self-organizing construct, for example, they have to deal with their own stuff, right? They can't go running to a manager now when something goes wrong. So the corporate rebels guys in the Netherlands, they've been busy setting up a fund to try and buy companies, small companies, and put them into a much more self-organizing construct. But they've been finding that it takes 18 months to 2 years to really get people to make the head shift and to be able to operate well in this what is kind of genuine empowerment, I guess, rather than just kind of a bit of delegation. So it is possible, but it's not as simple as going, "Oh, look, you're all empowered now. Get on with it." It's people have to unlearn one set of beliefs about the world and learn a new set. It looks like.
Yeah, and this ties back to like the concept of who actually runs the company. You mentioned in the beginning that employees in the bottom layer actually have a lot of collective power, and that basically they could just not do the bullshit that is being put upon them.
Yeah.
Why don't more people rebel?
Yeah, I do think it's this kind of comfort. I don't know if you've ever come across Barry Oshry's work in this space.
No.
He's a very obscure American academic. He started doing these things in the 60s where it was called the Power Lab, where he would bring in 20 strangers off the street, basically lock them up for a week in a compound and create a virtual organization where you had what he called tops, middles, and bottoms and customers. And then he would set these experiments running. But he noticed after a few years that it didn't matter who he put in the experiment, the same patterns of behavior always came out. And one of the patterns of behavior was concerned with the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, who he said were oppressed and didn't ever realize the collective power they had, or weren't, they were so comfortable being oppressed that they didn't ever try to organize themselves and fight back against some of the nonsense. They just felt that it was blindingly obvious that the leaders were in charge and that they just had to do what they were told. So it is curious because you think, right, by the way, I didn't mention that there's some very bad effects of making people powerless as well at the bottom of the organization. Some research suggests that if you take away people's autonomy and if you subject them to a lot of job insecurity, which is what kind of happens at the bottom of these big companies, that was more predictive of early death than smoking or high blood pressure. So there's some really, and being very powerless also activates something called the behavioral inhibition system, which makes people much more risk averse and constantly kind of seek to avoid, putting themselves in the limelight. You just want to try and be safe. And that kills all sort of creativity and innovation. And then we wonder why at the customer interface level, we don't get amazing service and amazing creativity. It's always crap. But we've kind of, we've created a situation where we've made that impossible for people, by scripting everything, policing everything. We've kind of taken the humanity out of it to some extent, right? So, yeah, there's lots of interesting dynamics going on there. That would be a lot of fun to play with.
Yeah. I'm curious to ask you about something completely different.
Cool.
We briefly touched upon this fad of AI, which replaced the metaverse as the new thing that everyone's falling behind on. We chose, perhaps dangerously so, to kind of ride the wave of that fad in Maneuvering Monday, where...
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to spoil exactly what happens, but AI ends up playing a role in the end.
It does.
Well, why should CEOs tread carefully when it comes to AI? And
there are many reasons. God, where do you even start? So AI is it's got the wrong name for a start, right? Because actually the models, even though they're improving at quite a rate, none of them are actually intelligent. They are based on the probability levels of predicting the next word in a flow of words, and while they're on the surface very, very sophisticated, there's actually no thinking going on behind the surface, right? So, and I see the use cases in some situations, but my fear is that consultants and the tech companies are selling this dream to CEOs that they can automate away a huge chunk of their workforce. again, it's the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? That they can do away with them by using AI. And that's very dangerous because unless you actually know what people do, you can't really appreciate that and you can make a lot of mistakes. In the book, I gave the example of a friend who was a teacher assistant. And if you looked at that from an organizational chart and job description point of view, you'd go, okay, what do they do? They help prepare the lessons, they mark some of the homework, etc., etc. And you think, okay, well, we could just replace them with an AI classroom assistant that can do all that, right? Yeah, it's easy. But if you talk to the teacher assistants, what they actually do is something that's not in the job description, is what they do, things like they take care of kids that come from really difficult backgrounds, who turn up at school not having had any breakfast, and they use their own money to buy them food. Sometimes they buy them clothes, sometimes they give them a hug. Often they're the only stability and love in that kid's life. And if you take that away, you can risk a lot of damage to those kids because that's all they have. But people don't understand the nuances of this kind of thing. Let me give you another example. I flew to a small airport in France to go on a sailing trip. I had 7 massive suitcases of stuff all piled up on the trolley. You could barely see me. Yeah. And I went to the car hire desk, and this lovely lady, she looked at me. She looked at all the bags, and then she said, it's like a 10-minute walk to the car park where the car is, and there's steps and some other stuff. I was like, oh, yeah, damn. And she said, look, I'll tell you what, don't worry. I think you're my last customer for a while. Why don't you go and have a coffee? I'll go and get your car and drive it over to the terminal, and I'll beep when I'm outside, and I'll just give you the keys. Wow. Yeah. And I thought, oh my God, like you can't train people to do this, right?
No.
Like you either have to just really like people, and you certainly can't train an AI model to do this.
No.
So I think it's risky because we've created these organizations where we've effectively killed people's creativity. We haven't given them a chance to shine, and now we're going to fire them all and try to replace them with a robot, and it's not going to go well. It's not going to go well. So I can see things going horribly wrong. They have gone wrong for quite a few companies already. The city of New York got in trouble. It created a chatbot to advise small business owners on legislation. It started telling them all to break the law after a few months.
Oh no!
Yeah. McDonald's tried to replace some of their staff in the drive-thrus until these videos started going viral of the AI ordering like thousands of chicken nuggets and and doing crazy things like asking people if they wanted bacon on their ice cream and stuff like that. So there's a lot of money going to be wasted. My other fear is that the book talks a lot about all the nonsense around things like well-being and performance management and engagement, and you can see actually that you can see that companies are now starting to try to automate some of the nonsense with AI.
Oh my God.
My favorite example is HR is always hilarious in many ways. But what you've seen now is that a lot of HR has put AI into the recruitment space, right? So AI is now sifting through all your CVs and applications. And in some cases, they have AI doing the first interviews. And it's hilarious because on the other side, everyone's now using the same AI to write the CVs and prepare for the interviews. So, and because what AI has done is remove the effort in applying for a job, which you can now do with one click, they're deluged with thousands of applications that have to be sifted. And it's made the whole process actually worse for everybody. Because you now have thousands of people who aren't really interested in applying. They just applied. All their CVs are the same, so you can't tell any of them apart. You're trying to interview them with all this AI, which, can't think for itself. It's like a comedy show. So yeah, it is. It provides source for endless amusement. I can imagine comedy writers will be having some fun with this for a few years.
In the space of recruitment, my experience with AI has been completely hopeless. Like it is.
Yeah.
It only creates more noise.
Yeah,
and the best thing to do is just take it out, because then that is much more effective. And applicants using AI have just made everything so much harder.
Yeah, and everyone's just becoming, the other side of AI is everyone's becoming incredibly lazy intellectually because they're just defaulting to AI to write everything for them. And that's a big risk, I think. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. Yeah, I suspect that a bit like the metaverse before it, a lot of it is hype. People will invest a lot of money in it, but we'll see limited returns, I think.
Yeah. Paul, let's talk about the other side of HR, not just recruitment. But in your book, you are clearly not too impressed with HR.
No.
How can HR actually be useful? Or do they have a reason to exist at all?
It's something I've thought about a lot, actually. My first inclination was to get rid of HR as a thing, but I do think they have a space. I think, unfortunately, what's happened to HR is it's become kind of the entry point for nonsense into organizations and the sort of unthinking execution partner for nonsense dreamt up by people in organizations. So a lot of the time you'll get things like, someone will say, oh, well, McKinsey says that, companies have a 39% chance of outperforming if they have more diversity on their executive and their boards, which, by the way, is completely untrue and has been roundly debunked by proper academics. But, so now we better have a diversity team. We have to get on with lots of diversity stuff. So that's their kind of entry point into, letting nonsense into the organization. But even more importantly, when somebody comes up with a restructuring idea or a transformation plan, HR gets called on to be the execution partner of some of this stuff. And when it all goes wrong, HR doesn't look good. It's not really their fault, but they don't provide any challenge. And the other very funny thing, it's exactly what happened in your book, is for some reason, when anyone talks about culture, they go, oh yeah, that's HR's problem. We got HR's job is to fix the culture. And the HR people as well convince themselves that their job is to somehow create this culture, as if you could do that from a HR department. It's kind of weird. It's a strange idea, right? So they've created this situation where they're now the most hated function of any. I mean, people prefer finance than HR even. And, even the people that work in the profession, they know that everybody hates them. One of the most popular HR blogs in the US, written by a lady, and the title of it is I Hate It Here. That's the title of the HR podcast. Is there a role? Yes, I think there is, right? Because what I've kind of seen through the research in the book is that there's a really overly rational perspective that features in management. It's taught in MBA schools, it's taught on leadership development, and it's rewarded, and it's super, super rational and unemotional. And it assumes that organizations behave predictably, rationally, and not, that they're not crazy, which of course they are, because people are crazy, right? So there's something about, and then I talk about in the book about the dark side of efficiency, which, you can feel if you go to a Starbucks, for example, which I try never ever to do. It's incredibly miserable, right? It's it's so process driven. All the food's crap. It's designed for shelf life rather than taste. The employees look depressed. The furniture's grim. There's just nothing interesting about the whole experience. They force you to give them your name for the coffee cup, which I always object to. I don't know why. It seems bizarrely personal and impersonal at the same time. Yeah. And you compare that to, in the book I talked about 2 other coffee chains in London, which I love. One has come from America, but it's this guy who's was obsessed with making the freshest coffee in the world. So in the cafe, he's got like a roasting thing where he roasts the coffee every day in the shop. And then there's this crazy Willy Wonka kind of vacuum tube is going across the ceiling. And when you ask for your coffee, it sucks up exactly the right amount of freshly roasted beans, shoots them across the ceiling, drops them into the grinder, and gets ground just for your coffee. So it's like you couldn't get a better cup of coffee. It's just like, oh yeah, I love this. This is amazing, And it's cool. Like he doesn't care about efficiency. He just wants like the best coffee,
And whimsy.
So efficiency is a kind of it sucks the joy out of things, and it's a race to the bottom, I think. So HR should be the kind of defender of humanity and creativity against this efficiency-driven process thinking that's so endemic. It could also be the one saying, well, where's the evidence for this stuff that you want me to do? Well-being doesn't make anyone well. Performance management is hopeless. Employee engagement is completely misguided. So, why don't we just stop doing all this stuff and do something useful? I think that would be an interesting conversation for HR people to have.
I was just away I was listening in, but I was just feeding my baby for a minute. So I'm back now. Yeah. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
I think we need to start kind of slowly wrapping up now, but we would actually like to shift to gears a little bit and talk a bit about the publication process for both of our books.
Yeah.
And maybe, Ivana, you can frame that.
Yes, Paul, when we talked during the pre-call, I think we discovered an interesting difference between how we wrote our books. We invited everyone in from the very first draft and had people comment and peruse. You had like a closed door approach where you sat down and wrote first. How was that for you? And why did you choose to write in this way?
It was great. I loved it. I didn't have to talk to anybody. Yeah. No, I guess because, some of the things I was writing about they're reasonably controversial, right? And a lot of people hold things like culture and values and engagement and all that kind of stuff. They hold it quite dear and get very upset if you suggest that it's all nonsense. So I just wanted to be able to be evidence led and not really think about people's opinions. And I wanted to write something that I wanted to write, which was me going, right, I don't care what anyone thinks. This is what I think. and I don't care if you read it or not. I'm happy that I've kind of thrown it out there. Yeah, I did get in trouble with Nicole, my wife, at one point where she's like, when am I going to see a draft? And I said, never. And she's like, do you not want my opinion? And I said, no, but don't take it personally. I don't want anyone's opinion.
You can read the final printed book. You cannot.
Yeah. That's what I said. Yeah, you can have it when it's published. So yeah, I made a choice not to engage with anybody because I thought that would maybe dilute my thinking or make me a bit nervous. Even when I spoke about it with a couple of people saying this is the kind of thing I'm thinking about, they were like, oh, well, maybe you should tone that down a bit. That sounds a bit, a bit controversial. And I was like, no. I don't want to tone it. I don't want to tone it down. I want to tone it up, if anything. Yeah.
Well, that's so funny. We had the exact opposite strategy. We had like an extremely open door and wanted as many people as possible to listen in and taking part in shaping the story. But I think it's also two different books because we wrote a fictional storyline. Yeah. So it wasn't so much, it was our opinions, but it was also expressed through the life of a fictional.
Yeah, and I think it's worked really well in your case because I think the book has got so many layers of complexity in it and nuance that I think it's, I think that's worked really well for you guys. So congratulations. It's a great piece of work.
Thank you. I think for sure we would have ended up in a very different place if we had not involved other people. Because then it would maybe have been a book about culture programs. A piece of magnetic nonsense bullshit. No. I think it was a fun process, and especially getting to talk to all these different people and that was like my favorite part. Like we're doing right now.
Yeah, and I think for me also, after writing the book, a lot of people have got in touch with me, and I've met tons of interesting people, and I didn't expect that to be so fun after writing the book. Yeah, and that's been really, really good.
Let's wrap up. We did prepare a question that kind of looks ahead to talk a bit about the state of work.
Yeah.
And just to wrap this episode up.
Yes, and Paul, after reading your book, I was left with both super entertained, juiced, but also in a sense of despair.
Yeah, a bit depressed. Me too.
And that is like my reflections were. It feels like globally we are in a state where tensions are rising. There's more fear and uncertainty. The world is complex and unpredictable, and this feels like the environment where people will gravitate towards more bullshit and not less, because it is knowable and predictable.
Yeah.
So how do we leave our listeners with some sort of something they can do in their daily life about how to avoid the bullshit and gravitate towards a more data-driven approach?
Yeah.
What can the individual do?
It's a really interesting question, and I think the answer might lie a little bit in trying to persuade people to be more evidence-led. So actually, bringing the evidence into work with them, having some of those conversations about the evidence for some of this nonsense. But I think ultimately it'll come down to the small minority of leaders that are actually willing to examine their own beliefs critically. It's not for everybody, but there are a few of them around. And so I think it's trying to find those people to experiment, to test things differently. There's a curious story about a guy in the Belgian civil service who worked in some obscure department who has kind of under the radar turned it into a self-organizing team and done so well that by the time he announced it out in the open, no one could tell him not to do it anymore. So there is something about being a bit more like a pirate in this situation, maybe, and just going and doing stuff under the radar with your own team or your own colleagues and doing it so well that by the time someone notices, it's too late to tell you to stop.
Yeah.
So maybe there's something about that pirate idea that people could because changing the whole system is very difficult, right? So maybe smaller changes to the bit that you can control and see what happens, I guess. That might be the way forward.
I like the idea of just like as a small step, if you hear something that sounds a bit like nonsense, challenge it or ask like, why are we doing this? What is the purpose of this? And I think I think that the times where Marie is successful in the story is actually where she manages to kind of address when something is, where it's unclear why we're doing something.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
And it is, that influence skill that she had, that one is really, would be quite important in any effort to change anything, I think, is having that ability to genuinely influence people in a way that makes them not feel threatened, but more curious about something, I guess.
I think we can invite listeners to think about one small piece of magnetic nonsense in their work life that they can start, changing or challenging, or at least try to apply this mindset. I think it's helpful in all organizations.
Yeah, or even just think about ways to seek more autonomy as an experiment would be also kind of fun, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, test the limits of the power you actually have.
Yeah. But it could be just a bit of fun too. Have more. I think we all need to have a bit more fun at work, probably, in general.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think let's wrap it up with these words. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us on the show. It was such a pleasure.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Read Magnetic Nonsense.
Yes.
And Maneuvering Monday. Yeah.
Yes, please.